today I'd like to talk about the manual transmission conversions. I get a lot of questions from people asking, can I do a manual conversion on a facelift car? Now, before we get too far into that, let's just review. So in 2008, the very first V8 R8 was released in the US, and in 2010, the V10 version was released. They produced those two cars until 2012, and then there was a hiatus in 2013 in the US, and then in 2014, they released a facelifted version with the option for a manual transmission or an S-Tronic transmission. Now, this was the first iteration of the dual clutch transmission, and this was the first time that the Audi R8 had been released with the dual clutch transmission, both for the V8 and the V10 models. There was an option to do a manual transmission in those cars as well, but very few people opted for them. So it's a pretty rare car. Now, there are some special versions of that car. The V10 Plus is one of them. There were very few manual transmissions ordered with the V10 Plus, and they're pretty desirable cars. And then also the competition model. So I have a lot of people saying, hey, I'd really like to have one of these special facelift versions, but I really want that manual transmission. Is it possible to do a manual transmission conversion on that car? Now, the short answer is yes. But before you jump onto Auto Trader or Car Gurus and start searching for your dream car, I want to review some details on what all that entails. So to begin with, one of the great benefits of doing a manual transmission on an S-Tronic R8 or an E-Gear Gallardo is that it is completely reversible. There's no hacking necessary. There's no, everything that we do here at Third Pedal LLC is completely plug and play. So in the future, if the trends change and people want to revert back to stock and have that automated manual transmission instead of the gated version, they can do so, and there will be no trace that it had ever been converted. Now, the second benefit to it, of course, is cost. Currently, for one of those conversions, it costs in the neighborhood of about $20,000. Now, Lamborghini and Audi are kind of increasing prices for some of the components, and that price may go up accordingly, but right now that's about what we charge to do a conversion for one of those cars. Now, for a facelift R8 with an S-Tronic dual clutch transmission, to do a manual transmission conversion on one of those cars is far more intensive than doing one on one of the S-Tronic cars. And that's because the S-Tronic car already has the manual transmission in place. Now, to do a manual transmission conversion on an S-Tronic car, we utilize the original transmission, the original clutch, the original flywheel, unless of course people need a clutch job at that time, we can offer that for them. But all the components for the most part are already there, and we're just modifying what's already existing. Now, with an S-Tronic transmission, the problem therein is that you don't have the transmission. There are a ton of components that are required to be changed, and in fact, the frame is different on the S-Tronic cars. And I've got one right here that I'm doing a manual conversion on right now, and we have already done the necessary modifications in order to bolt in the transmission, but I kind of want to go through and show you what all is involved so that you understand why it only costs about $20,000 for an S-Tronic car, and for an S-Tronic car, you're looking at closer to $50,000. So let's take a look at what we've got here. So to start with, the frame is different. Okay, so now in blue you can see our original frame, and this frame loops around the back here, and the transmission would be bolted into here, and there's some other transmission mounts and things in order to bolt it in, and then it kind of sits in this space. The reason they had to change the frame is because where the dual clutch transmission sits would basically be hitting this frame section. So they had to design a whole new frame for this, and in fact the difference in the frame actually starts up here. So the frame is different from here down, whereas on the S-Tronic or manual cars or pre-facelift cars, this would be about 2 inches further forward from there all the way down. And this support right here, again, would be about 2 inches further forward, and would come to about right here on the frame. So what is required in order to do the manual transmission in one of these cars is you have to essentially weld in a frame section. And in this case, what we did is welded in a frame section from a cutout from a wrecked car, and welded it into the frame of the facelift S-Tronic car. And then the transmission, the manual transmission, would basically take up the space where this bar comes across, so this has to be cut. There's no way around that. It has to be cut. Now, it's possible in the future that you could go back and weld that piece back into place. We're not going to completely cut the bar out. We're only going to cut out the section that is in the way of where the transmission needs to go. It's not a huge deal, but it's very expensive and it's a huge liability. If this car were to get into an accident and somebody would say, hey, you modified the frame, then that could become a problem in the future, and so we're far more reluctant to do these conversions. Now, this conversion is going to somebody that I trust and is a friend, and he intends to own this car for a long time. And you know, we talked about the options and the issues and you know, potential concerns, and we felt comfortable going ahead and moving forward with this. Now, the second issue is many of the components are different here. So of course you have a dual clutch transmission, which just has a bolted on flywheel. So you need a manual flywheel and the hardware. You need a manual clutch and the hardware. You need all of the studs that bolt to the engine so that the transmission can bolt to the engine, because on the S-Tronic car it uses bolts instead of studs. The axles are different. The starter is different. The starter wiring is different. And of course all of the wiring harness for the transmission is different, which requires a completely different wiring harness. So because of all these differences, and there are other components as well that are slightly different, it's a far more intensive job to do a manual transmission conversion on an S-Tronic car. So at the moment, we are not currently offering to do these manual transmission conversions on these cars because it's just not cost effective. When people hear that there's a $50,000 sticker price, it's because we have to buy a brand new transmission, which is not cheap. All the components that we use are new components, which are not cheap, and it just adds up. So you could effectively buy a pre-facelift spec, do a manual conversion, do a facelift conversion on that car to the spec that you want, including the interior, all the leather or Alcantara wrapped pieces with the stitching, contrast stitching colors that you want and all that stuff, and you still probably save about $20,000 over doing a conversion to a facelift spec. So just wanted to kind of review that stuff since I get this question a lot, and I figured that this would be a good reference point so people can see exactly what all is different. I know a lot of people are not going to be comfortable with having their frame hacked up. That is something that unfortunately is necessary to do a conversion on an S-Tronic car. Now, another question that I get a lot is if it's possible to do a manual conversion on a second generation R8. Now, the second generation R8 ran from 2017 to the 2023 model year in the US. Now, the short answer for that is no, and the reason for that is because on the first generation cars, they all came with the modules necessary that can be coded for a manual transmission. The second generation cars were not equipped with that. So in order to do a manual transmission on a second generation car, it would require a complete standalone management system. That's why you've seen like UGR doing a manual transmission on a second generation R8, because they're already running a standalone management system. So it's just another step to install the manual transmission and do the frame modifications and that kind of thing for them. But in order to do a manual transmission that on a second generation car, that would be required to run a standalone management system, which is just another added cost on top of the expense for the mechanical components, the frame modification, all that kind of stuff. So very expensive endeavor to do it on that car as well. So hope you guys found this helpful. If you have any questions, drop it in the comments and I'd be happy to answer them for you. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hit the like if you liked it, hit subscribe if you didn't, and we will try better on the next one.